Okay, so coming to you from the barn. Hopefully the Wi-Fi signal holds and there's not too much commotion in the background. This should be a fun one. We're going to talk. This builds really nicely from last month's conversation, which was on weaning and the early going with horses. And I think a lot of those experiences actually can factor into what we often end up massaging into sex stereotypes with horses. Lynn is connecting and her audio will be live soon. And wow, oh, there you are. Hi, Lynn. How are you? Oh, are you still muted?
I don't think so.
Oh, there you are. You're fine. You're good.
Okay, good.
Um, well, thanks for diving into this one with me. Lynn, I was just saying that I think it follows on from last month's conversation about weaning and early training really nicely, because sometimes those experiences might drive what we end up perceiving as inherent sex differences between mares, geldings, and stallions. My interest, I was the one who came up with this topic, and my own interest came from some frustration. Honestly, I had a student who for the past many months was on a horse search, wanted to buy a horse, and was adamant that she wanted a mare specifically. And she had all the reasons it had to be a mare, and they were many of the stereotypical reasons you might list for behaviors that you attribute to a specific sex. And I kept encouraging her just to find a good horse, just be open to finding a good horse. Like, that's what matters. And she kept showing me sales videos of all these horses I felt like were pretty inappropriate because they were this narrow, it has to be a mare. And I got to thinking, like, where does this come from? Why is this so entrenched that we have these pretty firmly held beliefs? I read a lot of studies, I think you did too, to prepare for this, that showed we humans definitely have some strongly held beliefs about these inherent differences between the sexes. So where should we start?
Oh, how about if we start with that picture that you sent me?
Okay, yeah.
Because I thought that was really, let's see, we need to do this. Okay, there.
So maybe some of you saw this. It was kind of a meme or a funny photo that I saw floating around on social media. And the caption was, "That must be a mare." And I think that was coming from the fact that, like, her ears are the zebra's ears are pinned back and looking kind of feisty and maybe a little reactive. And I think we can all go, ha ha ha, yeah, it probably is a mare. But then I catch myself and go, well, why are we saying that? Is it because of these held beliefs that mares are more twitchy and irritable and et cetera, et cetera? Or, Lynn, you had a good assessment that maybe this is a female and was protecting a baby. That might be what happened, which is very different than the human attributes we give them of being reactive and moody and agitated, right? So where do you want to jump in here?
Well, yeah, that's the stereotypes. It kind of encourage people to make jokes about it. But let's look at the reality, because otherwise we're on the wrong path. So when I saw that, what I thought of was, that's a mare. She's probably protecting her foal. And what's really going on there is that oxytocin, the hormone that's related to maternal and social bonding, promotes the courage to defend those that we care about, especially the youngsters. And so it would be a natural thing for a mare. If the leopard was threatening her foal, she's going to go after him. So do we see this as a joke, or do we see this as a brave mother defending her baby?
Yeah, I think I love that that reference to oxytocin. That's an important one. I know that I used to attribute this sort of like protection just to stallions. Like, that was just their role. But you're right that it is often the role of mares to, they play a huge role in, well, in all horses, they can trade roles in keeping the band safe out in nature, in the wild. And that's not a negative.
Yes, and in all no, and in all mammals, it's mother to protect the young. But as you said earlier, most people do believe that there's significant behavior differences between mares and geldings and stallions, and mares are typically described as either loyal and brave, or difficult, impatient, touchy, temperamental, even aggressive.
Yeah.
While geldings generally get described more as like steady, reliable, more forgiving, less reactive. And naturally, we'd expect some differences because lust is a core emotion and it promotes different hormones in the different genders. But let's look at what's the reality of the behaviors behind it. And I found one study, interestingly, only one study of differences between mares and geldings. And there's ways that the study was nicely done in that it was a survey of over 1,000 donors. So that's statistically significant. And they did not know the purpose of the study. The pertinent questions were kind of couched in amongst other questions. And the results of the study really surprised me. It showed that there were no statistical differences in when horses were ridden, no statistical differences between the behavior of mares and geldings. And I'll admit that surprised even me, even though I think that a lot of these stereotypes are inaccurate. I found that surprising.
I did too. I think I read that same study. There were, if I remember correctly, there were differences that they noted, that the respondents to the survey noted in on the ground kind of behaviors, or maybe horses interacting in herds together, between mares and geldings. But when it came to riding, there were no actual differences noted. And I also found that very interesting.
And the on the ground differences that they noted were pretty minimal. They found that mares were more likely to move away when you go to catch them, and geldings are more likely to chew on their lead lines or blankets.
Yeah.
I mean, this is pretty. It actually doesn't surprise me because my personal suspicion is that mares are a little more sensitive about their personal space, and geldings, well, all the males tend to be a little more mouthy. So that, well, that really kind of fits. So while we wouldn't say that one study's conclusive, it does raise an interesting question. It's like, where did the idea of this marish behavior come from? And one of the researchers on this study had a pretty clear perspective. She said, this might be coming from the human world. Traditionally, there are stereotypes against women, that they're moody or bossy or difficult. And it's possible that this is just transferred onto horses as well. And that's really some serious food for thought.
I don't remember if it was in that same, I agree with you. And I don't remember if it was in that same study or a different one that on that topic of horses, of mares being, which is interesting because I've actually never heard this stereotype, but the perception that they can be harder to catch, like they're a little bit more evasive if you go to catch them up in the paddock, or they can be quicker to move away from, pressure, and we humans are often seen as pressure. And one of the researchers speculated perhaps this is something that is a very natural, innate trait of mares, because in the wild, when they're in their natal bands, they do respond to whoever the herd leader is, the protector. Maybe it's the stallion telling them, let's move on, let's move from this location to another. They, in the interest of survival and keeping their babies with them in that band, they're very tuned into those cues of, let's flee, let's move. And I hadn't heard that before. It's interesting. I don't know if there's truth to it, but I was like, well, gosh, that's interesting that the mares might be genetically more tuned into let's skedaddle pressure.
Well, that's one way to look at it. And another way to look at it is that they may be more sensitive and protective of their personal space. So it might depend on how you approach them when you go to catch them. So they might be quicker to perceive people as saying, move, rather than, hey, I'm coming to collect you so we can go do something together. But Sue McDonald, who's been the behaviorist at University of Pennsylvania's New Bolton Center for decades, I kind of said the same thing as that we're talking about here, and that's that most mares who were brought to New Bolton Center for supposed hormone problems actually had handling problems. So she was saying it's not for the most part that mares have hormone problems that need medically fixing. It's most often that people are just haven't handled them correctly. And the problem with this, I mean, this becomes both a welfare problem for the horses and a safety problem for people, because if you incorrectly dismiss behaviors as just gender related, oh, she's just being a typical mare, or this is just marish behavior, then you don't address the real causes behind the behavior.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. It's kind of thinking you have the answers already, maybe, or just not allowing the horse to express its full potential.
That too, yes. But there's a variety of possible explanations for any of these behaviors, and because it's so complex, I think your original question was how important is it to know somebody's bias of gender when you're choosing a place to board or somebody to train your horse. And I'd say this is really important because it's too easy to have a self-fulfilling prophecy and overlook a real issue. And the kind of real issues that have been dismissed, that I've seen dismissed or read about being dismissed as marish behavior, are things like poor socialization, which comes readily from early weaning or lack of adult role models. Behavior can come from lifestyles that are not conducive to healthy horse behavior, like the lack of what the behavior's favorite 3 F's, the friends, forage, and freedom. Food sensitivities, and I want to get into that a little bit today. Food sensitivity impact on behavior. That's there's not a huge amount of it really clarified in the literature, but there is some that's pretty clear, and a lot of reports from owners of huge changes when they change their horse's feed. Then there's also the natural variations in a mare's heat cycle, and then true medical problems.
Yeah, and I know that we're going to touch in a little bit. We'll get a little bit further into some of the just stressors in any horse's world that could lead to us attributing these behaviors to them being a mare or a gelding or a stallion. But real quick before I forget, on that note of that there is with mares, there is an estrus. And we can't deny that. The severity I have found with mares is so individual. Some mares don't seem to have a lot of physical discomfort, and some do. As we were prepping for this chat today, I was reading some of the studies that have been done for the Journal of Veterinary Science, and they did some interesting tests when mares were in heat with rectal and surface temperature and heart rate, and there are some physiological realities that do happen, and mares respond differently, and it can make them uncomfortable. And so as we sort of lead into the rest of your outline and conversations just in terms of helping all horses be better adjusted, I did want to make a note that, sometimes this reactivity that sometimes is attributed to mares, if they're in a state, in heat, or they're in a highly elevated sympathetic nervous system scenario because of their lifestyle factors, sometimes the tendency is to kind of, work it out of them, quote unquote. And when the muscles are flooded with, they're already flooded with stress hormones, and we ask a lot of them, they get so sore. Maybe you all have experienced a little bit of that in your own exercise regimes. And I think that just adds fuel to the fire, and can maybe exacerbate some of these stereotypes that we have, at least in regards to mares. But I've even seen it with reactive geldings. The harder you work on when they're in those elevated sympathetic nervous system states, often the worst thing. It doesn't make their reactivity go away. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. And I think I've people have said to me that people who have mares who are really who really do have uncomfortable estrus, and the people are sympathetic, which of course we women certainly should be sympathetic to this when mares aren't feeling good. And people have actually said, well, I have my my TLC protocol. So when my mare's in heat, we just do light work. I do massage, or we do groundwork instead of riding, or whatever it is that the horse can comfortably do, and just accept that fact. Of course, if the horse is really uncomfortable, then this may be a time to talk to your vet about what you could do to make her more comfortable. But in general, just being sympathetic to it, I think, can go a long way to easing some of the issues that come up.
Absolutely. So I want to make sure we have time to go through your photos here. So if you, or I don't know if they're in order, but if I don't want to miss out on time, always.
Yeah. So this is my husband's first mare, Sapphire. When she came to us, she was described as being a dominant, pushy mare, defensive about her stall. She scared people everywhere she lived. I was told, don't ever let her get away with anything, and don't try to lead her without a chain over her nose. And as you see here, we have a very relaxed horse who's enjoying an ear rub. And I wanted to like sort of personalize this and explain how we got from there to here. And well, the chain didn't last long. Synchronized leading took care of that. But otherwise, I made the mistake of anticipating pushy behavior from her. And this was back when I really was buying into the dominance theory. And so okay, well, I have to be pushier than she is, so she doesn't ever get the upper hand, so to speak. So I was assertive and stern and quick to correct her. And I realize now I created a vicious cycle that became a self-fulfilling prophecy, making her pushy. My husband never had a problem with her. She was sweet and gentle with him. And I couldn't understand, because he was a novice. He didn't know anything about setting limits. And I just thought he wasn't handling her correctly. So why was she so well behaved for him? And when Brandy came along, it became a lot more obvious. I shifted gears, and I tried focusing on helping Sapphire feel safe and recognizing that she might be sensitive and defensive rather than intentionally pushy. And so I just gentled how I handled her. I gave her time to comply. I didn't lower my expectations. I just was passively persistent instead of pushy. And her threatening, marish, so-called behavior completely disappeared. She just became as calm and gentle as she is in this picture. And I think there may be a lot of mares out there that react badly to pushiness from people because they're sensitive, and the pushiness makes them defensive. Then we label it as marish, then it gets normal, then it gets worse. So those, I think, are the kind of handling problems that Sue McDonald was referring to.
I think you're right. And that's such a cool story. And as you're talking, I was just kind of wondering out loud here obviously, if a horse is on a strict performance or show schedule, and you need to sort of control their estrus cycle, that's a separate issue maybe. But I'm wondering, as I listen to your personal example, if the tendency would have been to treat these, quote, marish tendencies with supplements or Regimate or other things that are available, rather than, and treat them that way and then not change anything about the handling. If you would have had such a seismic shift in this particular horse human connection, think sometimes if we have something to give the horse, we don't tend to change our habits around the horse as much, maybe. And I'm just kind of talking out loud, but it's interesting to think about.
I think you're right that's if it looks like, well, we can just give them a supplement because that's what they need, because this is all hormone driven, so we need to fix it. Then you can kind of go off on the wrong track. Although, I mean, this happened to be what worked for Sapphire. What for another horse, it might be that they need a food change. And I want to come back to that in a minute, but maybe clarify some of the things that we can do behaviorally to calm horses down. Like set a calm, positive tone, and watch the behavior. Watch for the emotions behind the behavior. Instead of taking offense if a mare's behavior doesn't look quite right, think about what's she trying to say. So if we look at this picture, I am standing behind Shiloh, and she's got a hind leg picked up. And if you look just at the back end of that picture, or the back end of that horse, you would think she's threatening me. She is, in fact, very grateful that I'm cleaning her udder and picking her leg up to get her thigh out of the way so I can reach her udder and clean it more comfortably. So we always have to really look at the whole horse and the emotions behind it and give the horse the benefit of the doubt. Shiloh picked her leg up for years, and I scolded her for picking her leg up when I was grooming her. What she was really trying to do was say, listen, I'm trying to point to this body part that really needs some help. And it took me a long time to understand that's what she was doing, that her face and ears were not showing any sort of threat to me. And horses also need to learn to control themselves. That's just basic good ground handling. That helps horses learn to control themselves and tune into us. That has to be taught when they're in a low state of arousal. They're not going to learn anything if you wait till they're already wound up and try to get the horse under control.
Yeah.
And you had talked one other time about people who lunge a horse who's wound up, and and then at best you have a tired horse who might be compliant because they're tired. Well, I saw a really interesting variation on that. Sapphire's behavior was mostly pretty good once I figured out how to engage with her. But we had a centered riding clinic at our place one time. We hosted the clinic, and Mitzi Summers was the instructor. And Jerry was going to ride Sapphire in the clinic. And when the strange horses started showing up, Sapphire had a meltdown. She had an arched neck, flagged tail. She was screaming, running around, squirting urine. And Jerry quite prudently took one look at her and said, I'm not getting on her today. And Mitzi said, let's see what we can do. So Mitzi took Sapphire into the arena on a lunge line, didn't even bother taking a whip. And Mitzi stood there looking like she was about to fall asleep, literally yawning, and just let Sapphire move. And there's a big difference between making a horse move and allowing them to move, because the horse who's upset needs to move their feet. Let them move their feet, and then that gives them a better chance to get themselves under control. So Sapphire ran around Mitzi for a minute or two, and then she started looking at Mitzi, and then she started looking kind of puzzled, like, wait a minute, Mitzi's not telling me to do anything. Why am I running around here? And after a few minutes, she walked over to Mitzi, stood in front of her, like, okay, what's the plan? And Jerry saddled up and rode her in a mixed group and had no problem. So there's a big difference there between letting a horse get herself under control and attempting to do it ourselves.
That's a good reminder, and obviously applies to mares, geldings, and stallions. A good reminder for us. Yeah.
So true. Yes. So did you have another direction to go, Jack? If not, I'm going to move on to the food. food issue.
Oh, yeah, I do want to cover the food because we had a listener question come in, and it was interestingly enough if we had heard anything about soy soy products having an effect on mares. So let's cover that in a sec. Just real quick before we forget or run out of time, I did want to circle back to something you had mentioned earlier in relation to geldings using being a little bit more mouthy and chewing on lead ropes, and maybe when they're in turnout areas together, maybe being some can be more aggressive and whatnot. And what's interesting about that to me is I've always been taught that stallions, like their mouth and their chest belong to them. That is not an area we should like coddle, because that is how they fight and protect themselves, in nature. So I think not encouraging stallion, obviously a gelding at one point was a stallion, not encouraging them to be mouthy. Sometimes this can be determined if they're really lippy or bitey. It can be determined by when they were weaned, interestingly, or yeah, pretty much when they were not weaned, castrated. They can, if it happens later, again, it depends on the horse, but what I was reading this morning was that some male geldings might exist in what they call a suspended development stage, where they're gelded late enough that some of these more hormones started to develop that would make them be slightly more aggressive, and that expresses itself a lot of times by using their mouth. Maybe they bite their play buddies and chew on lead ropes, and maybe can be a little nippy, and that is something that's sort of in there. Obviously you can help train that out, but it was an interesting little tidbit that came up, again tying into our earlier conversation from last month or 2 months ago. The knowledge about the early years of your horse, the weaning, and in this case the castration, it could provide a lot of insight.
Yes, and I think going along with that, it might be hard to separate them, is that if they haven't been well socialized as youngsters, they may have more difficulty in their interactions both with people and with other horses. And and then there is, of course, the issue that food can be an issue for geldings as well.
Yeah. So yeah, let's dive in there. Food's such a big issue.
Okay.
It's such a big thing.
Well, it is, and there's some really big catch-22s here. Food sensitivities really are more common in horses than is generally recognized, and they can actually impact their behavior very, very quickly after they ingest them. And the biggest issues generally are either sugar or the legumes, such as clover, soy, and alfalfa or lucerne. And that's because these contain phytoestrogens, which are compounds found in plants that function similar to estrogen. And soy is especially high in these. So it's assumed that this is the actual dynamic behind it. But the behavior changes that have been documented in other species include excitability and aggression. And that's in both genders.
Wow.
And people have reported in horses too. I'm not holding my breath for anybody to do a study on this in horses, because soy is the main protein used in so many feeds.
Yeah.
And so and it's relatively inexpensive. Mostly it's palatable. So I don't think that there's going to be anybody putting the money up to say that soy is not the best thing to put into horse feed. So it's up to us owners to watch. And a number of people have reported that when they changed their horses off of a diet that included soy or alfalfa, or even in some cases clover, that the horses went from actually aggressive to calm and pleasant and easy to handle. So it can be a huge difference. And the only way to know is to try a diet change with your horse and watch what happens.
Yeah, I've been in that scenario with a horse in an allergy, didn't really know what was going on. So we sort of started guessing and cutting stuff out, and it made such a difference. I mean, the horse went from like volatile and like kind of sketchy to ride to being a pleasant riding horse. So
Mhm.
yeah, thanks for shining a light
Yeah,
on.
that can be really, really critical. Um, and somebody asked me a question on my page about mares who act like stallions and who go and mount other mares. And that one of the little tidbits I found only one place, but a suggestion was that this can happen in mares who have been on anabolic steroids,
Mm.
as well as those who have certain ovarian tumors. So if you've got a mare who's acting like a stallion, this is definitely a conversation to have with your vet about what it could possibly be. But for an awful lot of those difficult behaviors, testing a food change, I think, can be a very simple, safe, economical way to find out if to see if you can get some changes in behavior.
Wonderful. Okay, Zoom's telling me we have 10 minutes left, just so we can strategize. So,
Okay.
which of these do you think we can get through all these photos? I want to see what you have.
Oh, this is the last one that I really wanted to make sure we got to.
Oh,
This
look at
is a
him.
stallion. So this is a Dartmoor stallion, and he's at as you can see, a large event there. It was a mixed class, lots of activity going on there, and you can see him standing politely in harness. An example of that stallions can be, in fact, some of the nicest gentlemen I've ever met were stallions. With the right socializing and raising and handling and training, stallions can be very reliable. So but there's that stereotype that stallions are innately aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
I think lots of people grew up reading the Black Stallion books, and I tried rereading the first book a while ago, and I couldn't get past the first chapter because it kept being reiterated. The horse was a stallion. He was aggressive because he was a stallion. It was never mentioned that he was aggressive because he had been abused, and people had made him aggressive by being aggressive toward him. So I think there's this image that stallions are aggressive, and they're really not. In the wild, more peaceful stallions have more loyal mares and more healthier babies. And because being aggressive doesn't support a family in any way. So a lot of what causes domestic stallions to behave aggressively is that they're often isolated. They've been poorly socialized. They're not raised with adult male role models. And then people treat them aggressively because they're anticipating that aggression. So people are actually modeling to the horse, be aggressive in your interactions.
Mm-hmm. I think it might. Oh, sorry. Go on. Finish your thought there.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think probably it's worth reminding us all, Lynn, you're so good at explaining it, on the roles that horses actually do play in the wild. So you've already reminded us that, stallions aren't out there just taking punches at everybody. They, and that these bands of horses really are, it's more of a cooperative state. There isn't necessarily the one quote alpha mare who's in charge, or the one stallion. It's more sort of a cooperative, but you have a better way of explaining it. So maybe just remind us about how things play out in nature.
Well, in a natal band, typically there will be one main stallion, but sometimes there's multiple stallions, and the roles of the different stallions may vary. There may be two stallions who share the mares, two stallions who each have their own mares, or a stallion who's the main one, but the younger stallion gets to mate with the main stallion's daughters. So it's really a pretty sophisticated variety of interactions among the stallions, but the stallion's role is protector of the herd, because he's got the opportunity to be vigilant while the mare needs to be eating and nursing the babies and growing the next baby. And the adult mares generally share the roles of decision making in the group. The older mares may be more likely to be followed, but it's not always the same mare who decides now we're going to go somewhere. One might decide we're going to go off to graze. Somebody might decide, oh, it's time to go find shelter. I see a storm coming in. Somebody else says, it's time to go get a drink. They're most likely a lactating mare who needs more water. And I've talked to people who've observed these very variations amongst groups of broodmares.
Yeah.
So their main role is taking care of the babies, but they're very much sharing it. And there've been reports of if a mare is killed, her friend might take and raise the baby who's left behind. So there's a lot of cooperation in a herd. They thrive on cooperation, not on competition.
And
it's humans that cause that.
Yeah. And I guess as we sort of close and wrap up, I'm interested in your take, but when I look back of all the horses I've worked with, I do sometimes find myself using this stereotypical language, like, oh, making mare jokes or, dopey gelding jokes. And, but if I'm honest, I have not noted any differences between training and riding mares versus geldings. I really haven't. I don't have a bias towards one being easier or more difficult than the other. And that's based on a lot of horses. So, I will be more careful to check my language as it comes out and I make these little jokes and remarks, because I actually don't believe in it. How about yourself?
I completely agree with you. That's exactly what I have seen. And when I was looking for a horse, it was like, a good horse is a good horse, as to where you started from. A good horse is a good horse, and the gender is not really relevant. And I found it interesting that when I posted my the announcement of this, the very first comment that came on was, mares are only more difficult to train if you're trying to use force. And whether that actually is different than using force with a gelding, I don't know, but it was interesting that somebody had that perception. And certainly that's the way it was with Sapphire. When I tried to use force with her, she pushed back. When I foolishly used it with Bronze, he was more apt to go into passive resistance. Whether that's common difference, I don't know. But like you, I've had the same experience that it doesn't make any difference. You treat them as each individual needs to be treated, and they're willing to be cooperative partners.
And and then we come full circle to food, forage, or to forage, freedom, and friends. I wonder if a lot of the idea that geldings are more, chill and mellow comes from the fact that perhaps they're more socialized. I've certainly known a number of self-mutilating stallions in my lifetime. And I think that comes from the crummy life that a lot of stallions have to lead, all isolated. I mean, I don't know if they have to, but these particular stallions were leading a challenging existence.
Yeah.
And maybe the same could be said of mares. Maybe if you get a mare who's experiencing some stress and is reactive and spooky and agitated, and then you start isolating her more, those behaviors ramp up, and it becomes, as you said, a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. Perhaps.
Yes, I think that's very, very true. Stallions are so often kept isolated, and you think about it, if humans are kept isolated, then that's solitary confinement, and that's a recipe for mental health issues. Just outright make somebody crazy. And I think the same thing is true for horses. They're very social, and if they don't have their social needs met, and then it's harder sometimes to get their social needs met if they weren't socialized as youngsters. They didn't have the adult role models and nurturing that they needed to have in order to develop their social skills and be able to get along with other horses.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, let's see, we have less than a minute left. So just quick reminder, this will be posted on YouTube, and feel free to share it. And you can still post questions there on YouTube, and Lynn and I will do our best to check in and answer those. And Lynn will write up a little article that I will include the link to in the description of the video. And thanks for chatting about this with me, Lynn. This was fun.
Thanks, Jack. I'm glad you suggested the topic.